at that, not the X right in the middle of the building, he's created a group of social spaces like a cinema and meeting spaces and cafes where the users and the tenants of the building can meet. Okay, I think I'll stop this video here, just so we have an opportunity to take a conclusive kind of look at my students' work, which I always love to include. So how do we teach good design? I won't show you the process itself because it's very lengthy. You're welcome to come join my classes if you want anytime, open door invitation. But I'd like to show you some of the results of teaching good design. This is an award-winning project by one of our students a few years ago. Her name is Salsabil Amin. She won first prize in the Center for the Study of Built Environments International competition for graduate projects. Her project was located في عين السيرة in Fustat, and she used what we call shipping container architecture, so embracing this idea of using discarded or recycled materials. So her spaces were a group of shipping containers. They were on a scaffolding of structure. They could be plugged out and removed and put on a truck. The project was a hub for NGOs because she realized there are a lot of NGOs operating our city that are completely disconnected. They don't know what each other are doing. And she wanted a place where these people could come together with the community and share their resources, but also be able to reach out to the community. So it's an actual mobile building. The containers plug out, go on trucks, go visit communities, gather information, give them services, come back to the hub and plug back in, and so on and so forth. And it was, in my mind, one of the very successful projects that I'm very proud of. This next project is also a winner of the CSBE award. She's the first Egyptian to win this award, Mariam Zatoun. And her project was redesigning and creating a social community center for حي الزبالين في المقطم in منشية ناصر. And she built her whole project around understanding their process of recycling. At the time when this community was at its highest, before we had these foreign garbage contractors come into our city, they were recycling in the 1990s 80% of their garbage. And when I told this statistic to my friends who are working in waste management and sustainable urban planning in Europe, they were amazed. With all the technology and resources and funding and know-how that they have today, they're not able to reach 80% to recycle all of their garbage. So قرية الزبالين, with all the disadvantages that it has, was a very, very efficient system of its time. And using, again, the landscape of the area, this is Samain Cathedral that is carved into Jabal al-Mu'attam. It's the main cathedral of that community that's predominantly a Coptic community. It's a beautiful space, it's a beautiful cathedral. I think, and I hope someone can check me on this fact, I think it's the largest rock-carved cave cathedral in the world. And she embraced that idea of carving into the rock and created this beautiful community center out of a discarded rock quarry, mahgar, adim mahgur fil mu'attam. So she was even recycling old architecture and creating something new using this technology that was on site. And this final slide is another award-winning project that we had by Zina Adli and with my colleague Dr. Hisham Gabr and myself, of thinking of how we can reconnect our city to the Nile front. A lot of us, I mean, we all are citizens of this beautiful city, and we have very little connection to one of its biggest assets, which is the Nile. So this is a floating park that she suggests can be built as a prototype. It was located قدام قصر النبي in the Ma'adi district, but it's something that could be replicated throughout our city. And I just felt that it's important to also include our students' work, because I don't like to present through these lectures these utopian dreams, and some of you leave and say, oh, that was wonderful, but that's in Europe, or that's in Japan, or that's in somewhere else that could never happen here. It can happen here, and it is happening here. And with the work that I'm seeing our students producing, in a few years, they will begin building these projects here. So I'm very optimistic that this movement towards good design can happen. And for those of you who are non-architects and architects in the audience, I want to leave you with this statement that good design is a basic human right. And it's actually something I'm calling for through UNESCO UIA to include it in our Declaration of Basic Human Rights. We have a right to have well-designed cities. We have a right to have well-designed architectures that makes our lives easier. But in order to demand it, we have to first know what it is. Thank you very much. إنجليزي يعني بتفرقش معي اللي يريحكم.
I appreciate you. You select a wonderful topic for this lecture, designing everyday life. Wonderful topic. Your presentation is very wonderful too. But I have a question. Is there a relation between architecture and autism?
Of course, yes.
Of course. How, and is there a relation or not? Thank you.
You're welcome. Pardon? You're a psychologist. Okay, great. All right. I'll tell you a little story about autism and architecture. In 2002, I was a new mother. I just had my first baby. I was a PhD student. I had just finished about 16 months of preparing a proposal for my first comprehensive examination that would then approve my subject so I could start writing my thesis. And I had been working on a completely different subject. I'm almost embarrassed to tell you what it was because I now think of it as a very irrelevant subject after I've worked in the area that I actually ended up working on. And I had my proposal ready, and my advisor, who's a wonderful woman, many of you may know, Dr. Zakiya Shafi'i, a very brave woman, one of Egypt's very first female architects, so a pioneer herself. She was waiting for this proposal, and I decided to show it to my father-in-law, who's an architect for Dar al-Handasa here in Cairo, who is an extremely talented architect. I call him the architectural encyclopedia. He knows everything about architecture. So I showed it to him, thought I'd get his opinion and his feedback about what he thought of my other subject. And he read it, and he was very kind, but he's a very honest man. And he said to me, it's interesting, but you know where it's going to end up. And I said, yeah, probably it'll end up on a shelf in a library somewhere when I'm done. And he said, well, you'll be lucky if it's on the shelf. It may be in someone's drawer or even in the trash. I don't think it's important, this whole proposal. So any of you who are doing your thesis work and studying, imagine being in my position, knowing that your exam is months away, knowing that your advisor is waiting your final proposal, knowing that you've worked on it for 18 months already, to hear that. So I made a decision. I could have said, I don't agree with you, I'm going to do it anyway. I could have broken into tears. I could have done many things. But I decided to ask him why. And he said, I'm a practicing architect. I've been practicing architecture for 40 years. And whatever outcome you will get out of this will be useless to me. I won't need it. It's not important to what I'm designing. I can't possibly think of anyone designing anything that would need this information. And doing a PhD, you have to provide information. You have to provide something new. You have to provide something useful. You have to provide something that is going to push the world of architecture forward, even in a small way, but it has to be effective. So at the same time, quite coincidentally, يعني ربنا بقى بيرتب الحاجات دي, I was asked by family member and a few of her friends to visit a school that they were starting for their children who were diagnosed with autism. This was in 2002, and I know it doesn't seem that long ago, but in 2002, no one knew what autism was. We even as a family didn't know what it was. So when she came to us, as young architects, myself and my husband, we said, okay, fine, terrific, we can design anything, we're architects. So I went to our references. All of you know our references. I said, I'll find a chapter on designing for autism. There's a chapter on designing for the hearing impaired and the visually impaired and the physically impaired. And among those, I will find a chapter for designing for children with autism. It did not exist in any reference, anywhere in the world. No one knew how to design for children with autism. I wrote emails to people of the International Building Code. I wrote to the American Disabilities Act. I wrote to UNICEF. I wrote to UNESCO. I looked to UNHCR for basic human rights. I was trying to find anything to tell me how to design for children with autism. So I told him this story, and he said, well, there you go. There's a real problem for a real building, for real people, that you can do something about. Why don't you do that? So I called Dr. Zakiya up, and I think when we look back on our lives, there are little moments that change your life forever. If she had said no, I wouldn't be here today, definitely. I think my life would have taken a completely different turn. She's a very brave woman, a wonderful, wonderful scholar. And she believed in me. And she said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never heard of this before, but I'm willing to figure it out with you if you're willing to put in the work. We have a deadline in 3 months. I'll give you a week. If you can have a strong proposal on my desk in a week with enough information, enough resources, and enough credible information that I can be comfortable with moving it forward, I will do it with you. And she did. And we wrote our thesis. We went to the school. They were already in an apartment building in Maidi. They were brave enough to take on this challenge. They were generous enough to give me access to their space. They were open-minded enough to think that it would work. We took a group of classrooms, we redesigned one and left the other as it was. I spent 1.5 years living with the children, watching them operate within their space and behave within their spaces to the interventions that we had did. And throughout that time, I began realizing that there was an impact on the children's behavior. And then that became published work, and that published work became the index that Dean Dina was talking about, and then the index began winning awards, and now we're designing a school in Pakistan, and we're about to start designing another school in Saudi Arabia, and all of a sudden we are the only architects who are designing for autism from that one small decision. So to answer your question, whether there is an influence or not, basically So you have a little bit of a background about what autism is. So basically, for those who don't understand autism, autism is what we call a developmental disability, and it affects how these children, an experience like this, by the way, would have completely shut down a child with autism. They wouldn't have been able to handle it. Autism, I like to describe it as an alternative way of seeing the world. It's not a disease. It's not disability necessarily. It is disabling in that it creates a challenge for those who are struggling with it. But I like to look at it as just a different way of seeing the world. Like one man with autism that I was with in Geneva when we were talking about this with the Human Rights Commission, he said, "Who told you?" He's himself autistic. He said, "Why do you consider that the way you see the world is the right way to see the world? I mean, I represent 1% of the world's population, which isn't a tremendous minority. I mean, that's a lot of people. You're talking about millions of people around the world. They just see it differently. And that difference is with someone with autism. They will understand and process sensory stimulation differently. So we all experience our world through our 5 senses. Through sight, through hearing, through smell, through taste, through touch. And that's how we experience the world around us, and that's how we communicate with one another. Individuals with autism have a problem or a challenge with that processing system. They have certain sensitivities that are higher or lower than the typical person. I don't like to use the word normal because none of us are normal, we're all different. So an individual with autism can be more sensitive to sound, can be more sensitive to visual stimulation, or less sensitive. And the different combinations of that creates the behaviors that they have. So that's where the auto part comes from, the introversion comes from, the tawahud, where they want to be alone and enclosed upon themselves to kind of block out this world around them. And that's a very kind of simplistic, I'm sure our psychologist has a much more technical definition of what it is, but from the architect's perspective, that's how we defined it. And the test that we ran is that we started trying to identify, okay, so what can I do? So the first thing we did with one of the speech therapy rooms is that we soundproofed it. So if this child is hypersensitive to sound, and because there's this background noise, like for example, when that microphone started with the interference, if there were an individual with autism here, there was no way they could block that sound out. We could block it out and continue our conversation. We're not very happy. If it had continued, maybe we'd have gotten used to it. But a person with autism is unable to filter that out. And if you think of that inability from a very young age, in every experience as they're learning to talk, as they're learning to interact, it becomes very difficult for them to learn new skills. So the first thing we did in one of the classrooms is we soundproofed it. The children immediately started responding better. They were able to focus because the attention that they spent blocking out the noise all of a sudden was freed for them to learn something new. And we applied the same principle to their learning environments. We started doing something that I call a compartmentalization of space. So we took a classroom. I walked into the first classroom the first day, and I've written an article about this. And I walked into the classroom, and the first thing that came to my mind was chaos. There were only 6 people in the classroom. They had 6 teachers with them, so one-on-one, but there was chaos. Everyone was doing something different. There was a lot of noise, there was a lot of color, there was a lot of shapes, there was a lot of movement. And for me, as a typical person that doesn't have a sensory processing issue, this was very overwhelming. I couldn't imagine what it was for those kids. So I propose compartmentalizing the classroom into very specific activities. So there's a corner of the space that's just for puzzles. There's nothing else going on. There's no one else in there except the teacher and the child and the puzzle that they're working on. So everything else is cleared off the table, and that's all they have to focus on. So all of the things that we tested were inspired by one conversation I had with one of the teachers when I asked her, what can I do for you? I'm here, I'm willing to try anything. What can I do for you? She said, there are students I work with where I have a few moments, and it's just a very short period of time where I have their attention. We're looking eye to eye, they're focused, we click, they can get things done, and they learn something in those few seconds, and then it's gone. If you could take those few seconds and make them a little bit longer, if we could just have more of them, I know we can work much better with these kids. And that became our objective. What can we do spatially? By relieving them of all this sensory overload, by manipulating the sensory overload. So for example, we designed the spaces that flowed naturally along their pattern. So for example, if their schedule is we arrive in the morning, we sit down for breakfast, and then we do circle time, and then we do puzzles, and then we do speech therapy, we made sure that they're not jumping around different spaces and moving across different experiencing and passing noisy spaces and colorful spaces to do that schedule. We made sure that that schedule was smooth. So they didn't have to deal with anything more than what they needed to learn. And that became the first step. There have been times where I have critiqued myself that this is very, what I call creating a greenhouse effect. It's like taking a plant and giving it its perfect environment. Of course it's going to grow, but if you take it out of the environment, it's going to die. So you can create this perfect environment in the school or in the center for the child, but when you take them out into the real world, they then have to deal with the reality of the real world. And there is a different approach. Other researchers are working on the exact opposite of what I'm working on, which is forcing them to normalize themselves and forcing them to cope with the reality of the world. And I think the solution is somewhere in between. What I propose is starting this in what we call like the survival stage, where the children are completely nonverbal, completely non-attentive. You can't get through to them. They're not communicating with any way. Their tantrums and outbreaks are just getting too much in the way for you to get through to them. You need to do this. And once they start gaining skills, you can start taking away a little bit of that support until ultimately the objective is for them to be independent in a typical built environment. But there are some that that will never be the case. Their autism is so severe. Again, when I was in Geneva, there was one advocate that was supposed to be speaking with me at the United Nations, and he had to speak over video conference. He couldn't even do it live video conference because of the overwhelming sensory stimulation. And the reason was, he said, there's no way I will be able to get from my house to this place in Switzerland, which is the cleanest, quietest, most organized space on earth. It was just too overwhelming for him. So that's basically the approach. The index that we've created is called the Autism Aspects Index. If you want to look it up, there are many articles that have been written about it recently, and that I've written about it as well. I'd be happy to share them. Maybe Hela can make them available for everyone. You're welcome. Do you agree? Yes? Any comments? Thank you.
You mentioned that, and I was very interested, Magda. Do you think that you as an architect can do something?
We have to, of course. I mean, you're talking about 70% of our population in Cairo lives في العشوائيات. To say that it's a hopeless case I would quit my job tomorrow if I thought that. I think there has to be something. And I think the first thing is to stop looking at it as a problem and stop thinking of it as, it's interesting that for many years, the map of Cairo was drawn as central downtown Cairo that we are in and that we all know, and then this black belt, and then all these beautiful new مدينة مش عارف مين ومدينة مش عارف إيه وحي مش عارف إيه, and then this black blob in between, and that was العشوائيات. And that black blob began as a thin margin that the policymakers wanted to ignore, so they black it out. It doesn't exist. It's something, it's a problem, we'll deal with it later. But it has grown and has become the reality of our city. And not only our city, many cities all over the world. Again, I think that there is a lot that can be done. Like I think, first of all, documentation. We need to understand how these communities work, because they are working. I mean, the people that are living them are living functional lives. They are actually the majority of the service sector of our city. They are workers and employees and bank employees and teachers and everyone. I mean, I can not think of a single citizen that is not representative somewhere في العشوائيات, because they represent the majority of our city. They are the major stakeholders, 70%. So I think the first thing we need to do is documentation. The second thing we need to do is change our position from looking at it as a problem. We need to start defining it properly. I think this idea of self-organized communities, المجهودات الذاتية يا باشا دي, is a very good way of shifting the mindset towards that. And thinking of small, what we call in architecture, architectural acupuncture. You find very effective things that you can do at a very low cost, things like the St. Augustine Barrio project of connecting them to the public transportation network in a way that doesn't force them to resort to the behaviors that they do. I mean, the traffic tuk-tuk microbus psychology is a means of survival. They have to get around the city. There was a very interesting project in Mumbai, in one of the largest actually ashwaiya there, and they also have the tuk-tuk is actually an Indian invention. Yes. The Tata is an Indian invention. It's one of the biggest. They now own, I think, Rolls-Royce or something. They're like the largest automobile company in the world. They documented the tuk-tuk routes in this ashwaiya like a subway map. There are stations and there are stops and there are routes. It's not chaotic. It is very organized. It's like a shuttle system. They go from point A to point B, back and forth during certain times of the day. There are certain areas, yes, they may be managed in a mafia kind of way, but when you have no transit authority, of course there has to be a homegrown self-organized way of making this an economic viable system. So I think the first step is understanding them. The first step is shifting our awareness towards them. The first step is helping them mobilize their needs and starting to reconnect our city to the informal city. And the most interesting things, I think, are happening between the formal and the informal. That area, that margin in between where we can create connections. And there are lots of projects that we're working on currently. In my studio now, I'm going back to them hopefully tomorrow to see their work. We're looking at the informal vending, البياعين الجايلين في محطة رمسيس, and how, again, in a similar way, we can change the mentality of let's not look at them as criminals, let's look at them as providers to our informal economy. Again, the informal economy in Egypt is 30% of our economy. That's a huge asset. If you make them disappear, you've lost 30% of your economy. So we're working on semi-legitimizing them, giving them sites and services, but in exchange, being able to organize them in a way and kind of do a payoff of here's your space, we'll give you this in exchange for you staying in this space and not encroaching on the public space that belongs to the citizens of the city. So these kind of negotiations of presenting a middle ground solution. Questions? Please.
بخصوص الموضوع بتاع using free material for architecture. بصراحة أنا في مثال بيحضرني في الموضوع ده. المساجد في العصور الوسطى الإسلامية كان فيها مشكلة كبيرة جدا، ويعني في عدد كبير جدا من الناس بيروح يصلي والإمام واحد ومفيش sound system عندهم. They make it like very wide and make the roof very high that the imam can stand on the member and say his speech, and they use the space for making sound moves, reflecting and reflecting and reflecting, so he can send his speech for a very big number of persons, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example. I'm going to steal your idea and use it, if you don't mind, when I talk about these free architectural elements. A lot of times I think that technology has actually made us lazy, because without a sound system, that's a brilliant example. I mean, without a sound system, how can you have these large conversations, and how do they work? Then the architect is forced to really think about the acoustics of a space, and that's a beautiful example of a free acoustics. And acoustics, again, is one of the things tying back to the autism that plays a huge role, as you know, with children with autism, to manage the acoustics of a space, to make sure that they're only hearing what they need to be hearing, and there's no kind of background and interference and so on. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Firstly, I want to send you my thanks.
Thank you.
And I want to ask you if I'm looking for creativity.
Mm-hmm.
To be an architect, creative is restricted to